Hey, so today we're going to be looking at Multiversus Out of Bounds, but not only Multiversus. I feel that for whatever reason, my audience isn't really big into fighting games, and since there's so many fighting games that I'm passionate about, we're going to be looking at a grab bag of various titles, and also throw in an occasional highlight clip from past fighting game episodes. And honestly, I think that regardless of whether or not you played the games, you're going to find that there's a lot of really interesting things that you would never think about when checking out this vid. I'm your host, Shesez, and with that said, let's start off with Multiversus. So to start with, we have some unused content. In the 2 vs 2 version of the Adventure Time stage, there's a texture for a series of wands that are used that is stored inside the stage. As far as I'm aware, this texture is never shown to the player. And why it's left out, I have no idea, but the magic wands are a magical item introduced in the episode The Pods, where they come out of a thorny pod that grew from magic beans. Now let's take a look at the Rick and Morty stage. Going all the way into the back, you can see that the heads are 2D textures, but what's probably more surprising to all of you is that the helicopter is a series of 2D textures as well. The propeller and the body are separate, whereas the propeller is left on its horizontal side, and the body is sticking up vertically. And as you can see at this angle, the illusion is completely ruined, but you will find that it saves a ton on resources. Now, I was really shocked by this for Shaggy until I learned more information. If you take the camera inside of Shaggy's shirt, you can see that Shaggy's body is fully modeled, which goes all the way down to his pelvis. Now, this is what his body would normally look like, courtesy of the alternate costume, but it also turns out that in the beta, Shaggy could rip his shirt off for one of his taunts, which if I did my research right, is now available for purchase instead. Still pretty surprising, honestly. Normally, animators do not do this because there's a good chance that the body would clip through the shirt itself. What's way more surprising, and I don't think I'll get in too much trouble for this because there's no anatomy, like a Barbie doll essentially, Wonder Woman's body is also modeled all the way down to the waistline. Also, if we take the camera inside of Velma's head, you can see what's probably a beta element that's left behind. It's a bump map texture that represents her hairline, which as you can see by the final model, doesn't come anywhere close to matching to where the hairline is. Now, if we look at the Batcave, there's actually a lot of things to talk about here. The first of which being the bats, showing you that they're all 2D textures that feature a really low level of detail. I'm assuming that this is like a rotoscope or something that they just copied the frames for. And then all the dialogue that's way off in the background has words on them. It's the famous lorem ipsum copy and paste. Rather than get in trouble by writing anything that might not be approved by WB, lorem ipsum is a giant thread of dialogue that sort of resembles Latin, but doesn't actually say anything. We've found this a couple times now on Boundary Break, funny enough. And over here you can see that there's a texture for the face of the Joker. I believe this is the Joker that's used in the flashback sequence of the best DC animated film of all time, in my opinion, Batman Beyond Return of the Joker, which, if that's the case, that's a really good choice. And then over to the side here, you can see the famous penny that got its debut in the Batman comics. And in fact, the year of the penny represents the year that it was introduced, and that very same penny from that very same comic has the very same year. Moving over to the Scooby-Doo stage for just a second, you can see that there's a lot of references, but I just wanted to show you a couple of neat little things here. Like for example, the moon is not just a flat texture, there is some curvature to it, although it's not a complete sphere by any means. And the caveman trapped in ice is only a flat texture that has some bend to it to give it some depth. Also, this one's a bit freaky. The famous Steven Universe character here has 3 eyes. Fans of the series will know that. And again, I don't really see this very often. If you take the camera behind the character's skull, you can see that the colors and pupils of the eyes are significantly smaller than the ones that are used in the front. And Steven Universe himself has some really weird stuff going on. Hopefully I can explain this as best I can. I think the modelers messed up on his eyes or something, and there was a lot of compensation for that inside the model. So there's pretty much a paper airplane stuck inside of Steven Universe's head. And I think the reason why the modelers put this in here is for the reason that you're seeing right now. At certain angles, you can see that the inside of Steven Universe's eyes allow you to see through his skull. And I believe those white planes were meant to cover that up, but it didn't quite work the way that they intended. Also, the out of bounds areas, I thought this is really interesting how this works. So as you can see here, if the characters touch any of the sides that looks like there's space on the other side, they lose a stock. But if we pan the camera out far enough, you could see that that void eventually ends. And the reason for that is that the whole thing is just a texture with phony 3D depth. and that if you take the camera at certain angles, we can actually move the camera through that texture, and the power that it has to be the first thing that the player sees at any given angle just goes away because it's not modeled on the opposite side. Now, if we go back to the Batcave, well, that was kind of funny to say. Yeah, anyways, if we go over here real quick, we can take the camera over to Batman's suits, and you can see that they're low poly, which is really fun to see. Well, okay, I know that it has less polygons than the actual Batman, but there's still a lot of polygons here, to be honest with you. What's really not selling it up close like this is the muddy textures that, of course, the player would never get to see from this distance, which, by the way, I feel like this is a great transition from Multiversus now over to Injustice, where we can look at another Batcave stage and look at another low poly Batman suit. This one is significantly lower in polygon count, and the textures, whoo boy, the textures, like look at the belt, it's awesome. Although it's very difficult to see, if you take the camera inside the Batmobile, you can see that it has a red bat emblem twice on each seat, as well as other little details that are just a little too blurry to make out anything distinct. Unfortunately, turning the camera around will show you that the developers were really smart on resource management, knowing full well that the players would never be able to get to see the front of the dashboard, heck, as well as even the back of the Batmobile itself. Taking the camera outside of the intended boundaries for Aquaman's stage, you can see that the creatures that are all swimming in the background eventually just kind of deload, except for one for some reason. The squid that you occasionally see just hangs out in the void, waiting and waiting and waiting until it's put back into the player's view to be used again. Also, you might remember earlier when we talked about weird planes of geometry inside of Steven Universe, well, the Joker's no exception. If you take the camera inside and go down to his pelvic area, you can find a whole mess of triangles all clashed together inside. I just wanted to take the camera up and around for the city landscape. It's the cities that are often really interesting because although they look so densely populated with buildings, take the camera up and you see that the illusion is really convincing, yet so far from the truth, which serves as a great transition for the next game, Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Now, the camera for Marvel vs. Capcom 3 works on sort of an orbit, so I didn't get great footage for this game. Maybe I'll revisit someday if someone makes a more comprehensive camera, but for now, I just want to show you a couple of areas out of bounds, like for example, Spider-Man stage in New York, because once again, when you're playing the game, it looks super populated. Pointing the camera straight down like this will show you just how many buildings there truly are, and where those 3D geometry models end and flat background elements start to take its place. Also, from this angle, you can see where assist characters come in. They actually start way further out of bounds than you would think. In fact, if we stop the footage here, you can see that it's practically an entire stage length away from the player that's using the assist. And here's a nice smooth pan out of Asgard, the home of Thor. Again, I would take a much better look at all the details that are in the background, but due to the fact that it's tied to an orbit, it becomes really hard to be able to do that. Still, you can see how utterly massive the environment with the giant tree truly is when scaled against the player models, which are now microscopic at this point. And not to do a blast from the past, a really old episode of Boundary Break I might remake someday, we'll see. One of the most fascinating things that I felt like I found on that episode was that Shao Kahn was hiding an entire face underneath the mask. And if you were to completely remove all the geometry that would have the mask, his face would look something more like this, which possibly indicates that at one point there was supposed to be battle damage for the character. And then moving on from there, if we look at the background elements of the bridge stage, you can see Dagon and Serena fighting against each other. Now, Dagon and Serena are not playable characters in this game, so their models here are completely unique and made only for this scene, which makes it really surprising that although they are in fact low poly, we can't deny that, there's still a lot more detail to these models than you would imagine. Gotta keep in mind that these models are much further into the background than say something like Batman's suits in Injustice, so for them to have cleaner textures than there was in that game is pretty impressive. But anyways, moving on from that, let's do Capcom vs. SNK 2. This is one of those games that I would have loved to cover it on the channel exclusively, but I mean, how many people are still playing Capcom vs. SNK 2? I find this game in particular fascinating. What's really funny is that the fighters kind of act like HUD elements, so when you move the camera around, they're just stuck to the front of the screen, whereas the backgrounds are obviously fully 3D modeled. And for this stage, if we tilt the camera around, you can see that the word hotel is written out backwards, since your characters are fighting in the back of the building. And also, the backdrop element is just one flat texture, and you can see this one weird element in the corner here, and I was curious about what the heck that was, so I I extracted the texture and I saw that the pipes share the same texture sheet as the backdrop itself, and that it's just bled over into the background. Since all these stages are controlled very, very tightly, aka you cannot manipulate the camera much in any way or any form, when we take the camera off its axis, you can see that there's a lot of resource management being used here, and that something that seems as grandiose as the arena really is not all that impressive when you move the camera around. Like the pagoda that's all the way in the background is just a flat 2D texture, and the developers did a really good job of cleaning this all up so that there's nothing hidden underneath. In fact, stages that are even complicated like this desert one have a ton of resource management when you start to move the camera around. Like once again, just like in Injustice, the car seems to have complete pieces of geometry missing, and even those sand dunes, someone on the art team went through the careful consideration of removing every single try that would never be seen by the player, and so when you look at it from this angle, it's shocking how much is not rendered. And then you got the North Pole. This one looks super impressive. And once again, I'm really shocked at how well the art team managed to clean up all the resources to give you such a convincing illusion, and yet have so little to see as soon as you take the camera off its axis yet again. Here's what it looks like when it docks and all the audience comes off the boat to watch on the bridge. And then here in London, we have the fanciest CVS I've ever seen in my life. And when you move the camera around here, you can get a fine look at some of these other details, like the finest for play, something N-A-T-E-A-N-D, and then it's probably saying at the bottom for a good time. And the name of the restaurant is Pub Grub. These signs in the background here say, House of Richard Whittington, Mayor of London, stood on this site 1423. And here's a pan of how all that looks when the illusion is taken away. And here's an episode that you guys should definitely check out if you haven't already. This is the Dragon Ball FighterZ episode. One of my favorite scenes was talking about the Ginyu Force and how there's all sorts of interesting effects that the characters use. But when you take the camera off its axis, you can see that in truth, there's just a giant white sheet that's placed in front of the environment, and the various explosions and multicolors in the background are their own separate rectangles. And staying on the topic of Ginyu, here's what his special looks like from another angle. I got how it's supposed to look in the lower left-hand corner, but much to my surprise, the character shifts quite a bit around just to pull off a very simple-looking effect. And also for the dramatic finish for Gohan versus Cell, you can see what his weird-looking face looks like from another angle. Again, these are all 3D models, so despite the fact that they contort and do really weird things just like from the anime, you're gonna find that nothing is drawn out. It's all using the 3D models, which is very, very, very impressive. Alright, so I got a quick question for you guys. Which of these games do you feel like I should cover more extensively in the future? I think with an episode like this, anybody's gonna feel like, oh, you didn't look into that game long enough. If any of those games made you feel that way while watching this video, just name drop it in the comments section. Also, if you got the time, let me know what you thought of the video too. I don't normally do these grab bag type episodes, so if you like it, just let me know. Hopefully I'll see you next week. Later.